Mark Wagner took another slow sip of his bourbon before setting it back down on the worn, dark table that separated him from his two very confused brothers-in-law. He looked from one to the other, noting the tension in their faces. They had strongly protested his decision to divorce their sister, and it was easy to see their anger and confusion. The brothers, Brad and Gary, had asked Mark to meet them at this quiet little bar. The high-back booth afforded them some privacy, but they still spoke in hushed tones. Brad leaned forward, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Come on, Mark!" "You're not being fair. I know what our sister did was stupid, but you went along with it." Gary nodded vigorously beside his brother. "While there's no way I would have left my wife with a group of guys I'd just met, you allowed it. She said you told her she could stay with them and have her dances. I don't know why you'd do that, but you can't punish her for it now." Mark snorted and shook his head. "I think you guys have been skillfully misinformed. Tell me exactly what Jill told you." Gary gestured at Brad to respond, and Brad cleared his throat. "Jill said you ran into some new friends you had met earlier at that resort you visited last week for your anniversary," Brad explained. "She said they were a wild group, and you were all getting pretty drunk. At some point, you decided to call it a night and wanted to go back to your room, but she wanted to party more. You told her she could stay with them, but you'd had enough for one night and went to bed. Then later, when she tried to tell you about it, you were all upset and demanded that you both leave the resort a day early." Brad paused to take a breath before continuing. "She said you hardly spoke to her, and the two of you flew home. Jill said she tried to get you to explain why you were so angry, but you kept saying she'd made her choice. Then yesterday she got divorce papers served to her at work." Gary had been nodding to confirm all that Brad had said. "What the heck, Mark? You're divorcing my sister because she stayed out a little later than you wanted? That's insane." Mark shook his head, took another sip of his bourbon, and sighed deeply. "Guys, Jill didn't lie to you, but she didn't tell you the whole story." "Okay, well, tell us what she left out," Brad said, crossing his arms. Mark leaned back in the booth and began his account. "We'd spent the day on the beach. Jill attracted a lot of attention in the skimpy new bikini she wore. Several guys passed by our chairs for a better look, and a few even stopped and tried to strike up a conversation with her. She was obviously flattered and willingly engaged with a few who stopped to gawk at her while chatting her up. Several times I had to more or less tell them to move along, and Jill got a little huffy with me about being rude to her admirers." He paused, remembering the scene vividly. "I just kinda laughed and said I didn't want any of them to think my beautiful wife was available, so I suggested they find a single woman to chat up. I wasn't angry. I just wanted to spend some quiet time enjoying the beautiful beach with my wife. After I said that, Jill relaxed, but I could tell she didn't like me raining on her parade." Mark took another sip of his drink, eyes turning distant. "We headed back to our room and jumped into the shower together." The brothers grimaced simultaneously, and Mark nodded in acknowledgement. "Let's just say she teased me enough to get a reaction out of me, but then exited the shower, saying we needed to get going to make our reservation for dinner. We shared a bottle of wine and had a romantic dinner. I was eager to get back to the room, but she wanted to go dancing. As you know, Jill loves to dance, so we went into the little lounge adjacent to the dining area." Mark's expression darkened as he continued. "We danced a few times and then found a table. I went to the bar to get drinks, and when I came back, there was another table pushed up to ours with several young guys sitting around it and at our table. I walked up to the group and stood behind the guy who had taken my seat." His voice tightened. Jill looked up at me, reached up to accept her drink, and then resumed talking to the young stud sitting in my seat. I waited about 20 seconds while they talked. Then I sat my drink down in front of him and loudly told him he was in my seat. They both stopped talking, and he shifted over one seat. Before I could sit down, Jill shifted to my chair, patted her former chair, and slid my drink over to that seat. Mark shook his head, the memory clearly still painful. I wasn't sure what she was doing, but I sat down, and she reached over to rub the inside of my thigh. I looked down at her hand, and then turned to speak to her, but saw only the back of her head. She had leaned over to talk to the guy who had been in my chair. She was fully engaged with the guy and was just using her right hand to keep me distracted. Well, it worked for a few moments, but then I got upset and yanked her hand away. That got her attention, and she turned to face me. She quickly realized I was upset. Mark's jaw tightened as he continued. Jill proceeded to introduce me to Danny, Jim, Stephen, and Mark, the guys she had been talking to on the beach earlier in the day. She said while I was gone, they saw her sitting alone and came over to say hello. Before I could respond to her, she said she'd promised them each a dance, stood, and walked off with the guy next to her. Gary interrupted, his face showing dawning comprehension. So let me get this straight. She invited these guys to sit with you and accepted a dance with each of them without asking you about it. Yep, Mark confirmed. I had no idea what was going on. I was at the bar getting drinks. I didn't want them there, and I sure as heck didn't want to compete with 4 strangers for my wife's attention. So what did you do? Brad asked, his earlier hostility fading. I turned to the other 3 guys and told them Jill and I were there to celebrate our 7th anniversary, and I would appreciate it if they would give us some privacy and let us get on with our evening. Gary sighed, running a hand through his hair. I take it they didn't take the hint. Mark shook his head. Jill came back to the table with Danny. She was giggling as she sat down and chugged her drink. She then stood and asked me to get her a refill while she danced with Jim. I grabbed her arm and pulled her roughly back down into her seat. I told her she was done dancing with these guys and we needed to leave. His voice hardened. She jerked her arm loose and said she'd promised each of them a dance, and she wasn't leaving. I reminded her we were there to celebrate our anniversary, and my fetching drinks while she danced with strangers wasn't my idea of celebrating. Mark's knuckles whitened around his glass. Jill stood and said I needn't bother because she was sure one of the guys would get her a drink. She said she was just having fun and I was being a jerk because I didn't get what I wanted in the shower. At that, the 4 young guys all started laughing at me and commenting that I must not be able to show Jill a good time. Oh man, Brad said as Gary shook his head. At that point, I'd had enough, Mark continued. I stood and got into Jill's face. I said I'd had enough nonsense for one night and I was leaving. I told her she could come with me and try to salvage the rest of our holiday, or she could stay and party with her new friends. Mark's voice was quiet now. I shoved her purse into her hands and stepped away from the table. I paused and looked directly at her, and she didn't move. I could tell Jill was really upset at me, but I never expected her to do what she did next. She dropped her purse back onto the table and said she was going to finish her dances. She dismissed me by saying she had her own room key, so I didn't need to wait up for her. Holy cow, Brad said, now looking genuinely shocked. Okay, granted that's disrespectful, but is it really a deal breaker? I mean, I can see why you'd be upset, but she just danced with a couple of guys and then came back to the room. Did she apologize when she came in? Mark's smile was cold. Had she done that, maybe we wouldn't have had such a big fight. But it didn't happen that way. The brothers looked at each other and slumped in their seats. What happened? Gary asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark leaned forward, keeping his voice low. As you can imagine, I was very angry when I got back to the room. It was nearly 11 o'clock. I stormed around a bit, waiting for her to show up. I hit the minibar and drank a couple of beers. When I finished the second beer, it was almost midnight, and I knew the lounge closed at midnight. I decided to take a shower and try to cool down. He paused, draining the last of his bourbon. She still wasn't back at 12:45, so I slipped on some shorts and went back down to the lounge. The overhead lights were on, and they were cleaning up. I asked the barmaid if she had seen my wife leave the bar. It took $50 to refresh her memory, but she told me what happened after I left. Mark's voice grew quieter, forcing the brothers to lean in. She said 2 of the guys left, and Jill hung out with the other 2, dancing and drinking until closing time. One of the guys bought 2 bottles of wine and Jill left with the 2 of them. Brad and Gary exchanged concerned glances as Mark continued. I asked her if Jill seemed okay, and she said Jill was laughing and hanging on the guys but walked out on her own 2 feet. It cost me another $20 to get the suite number to which the wine was charged. Mark's knuckles were white as he gripped his empty glass. I knocked on the door of the suite number the barmaid had given me. A shirtless guy was laughing about something when he jerked open the door. I pushed past him into the room. Jill was on the couch making out with Danny. She was dressed, but Danny was touching her. The painful memory was etched clearly in his expression. The shirtless guy yelled a warning, and Jill and Danny separated quickly. I wanted to smash the little jerk's face, but he scrambled over the back of the couch and ran into the bathroom. Jill jumped up and rushed toward me. I stiff-armed her, and she fell on her butt. I then turned and walked out. "Geez," Brad exclaimed. "She sure as heck didn't mention any of that to us. She said she tried to assure you nothing had happened, and you shoved her away. She failed to mention she was in another guy's suite." "Yeah, well, she'd been doing a lot of that lately. Telling half-truths," Mark said bitterly. "A few months back, I thought maybe she was messing around with some guy at her work, but I had no proof. She denied it, of course, but things have been strained between us for weeks. I thought the anniversary trip to the beach might allow us to reconnect, but she used it to connect with some other guys." Brad and Gary stood, their faces now somber. "Sorry, Mark," Brad said. "The way she told it, we thought you just overreacted, but it sounds like our sister has messed up badly." Mark nodded. "Guys, ask her about what I've said and press her for an honest answer. I'm sure I could track down the barmaid if necessary, but I saw Jill with my own 2 eyes on that couch with Danny. I'm sure if I had waited another 20 minutes, I would have seen something far worse." The brothers stood and somberly shook Mark's hand. Gary patted his shoulder. "Sorry, man. We should have known you would not have done what she accused you of. We'll square everything with our folks." As they left, Mark ordered another bourbon. His mind was already turning, though not in the direction of self-pity. No. Mark was beginning to formulate a plan. 3 days later, Mark received an unexpected call from Danny, one of the guys from the resort. The call came to his office line, which surprised him. "How did you get this number?" Mark demanded. Danny sounded nervous on the other end. "Look, man, I didn't know she was married. She wasn't wearing a ring, and she never mentioned you until you showed up at the bar." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you want, Danny?" "I feel really bad about what happened," Danny said. "Your wife. She's been calling me and texting me nonstop since you guys got back. She wants to meet up again, and I don't want any part of this mess." Mark leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "Has she told you about our situation?" "She said you guys are separating and that it was already in the works before the resort. She said you were cool with her seeing other people. Is that true?" Mark laughed coldly. "No, Danny. That's not true at all. We've been married for 7 years. We were at that resort for our anniversary." There was a long silence on the other end. "Darn, man. I'm sorry. I really didn't know." "Send me copies of all her messages," Mark said, his voice suddenly calm. "I want everything." The next day, Mark sat in his attorney's office reviewing the screenshots Danny had sent. They were damning. Jill had not only pursued Danny after returning home, but had also openly discussed her marital situation, painting Mark as controlling and verbally abusive. She claimed the separation was a mutual decision and that Mark was fine with her seeing other people. "This changes things," Mark's attorney Richard said. "We have clear evidence of her attempting to continue the affair and defaming your character." Mark nodded, his jaw set. "I want more than just the divorce, Richard. I want justice." Richard raised an eyebrow. "What did you have in mind?" Mark leaned forward. "Something that will make her feel exactly what I felt when I walked into that hotel suite. Public humiliation, loss of dignity, the works." "Be careful, Mark," Richard cautioned. Revenge can be satisfying in the moment but often leaves a bitter aftertaste. I'm not talking about anything illegal, Mark assured him. Just a taste of her own medicine. Several days later, Mark's attorney called to say Jill had agreed to his terms. They would split all their cash 50-50, she would take a bit more than half of the furniture, and they'd keep their own cars and retirement accounts. She insisted they meet one last time before she signed the papers, and Mark reluctantly agreed. What Jill didn't know was that Mark had spent the intervening time implementing his plan. With help from his PA, Mary Ann, he had put together a comprehensive dossier on Jill's activities, both at the resort and after. Danny had reluctantly agreed to cooperate, providing not just the text messages, but also details about what Jill had said about her marriage during their brief encounter. More importantly, Mark had confirmed his suspicions about Jill's friend from work, Jane. A private investigator had documented several meetings between Jill and a male colleague, often at a hotel during lunch breaks. The evidence was circumstantial but damning when combined with everything else. She was already at the lawyer's office when Mark arrived. Richard told him she was in the conference room waiting. When Mark stepped into the room, she stood and moved toward him, coming in for a hug. Mark skirted around the table and sat. Jill looked hurt, but she returned to her seat. "Okay, Jill, you asked for this meeting. What do you want to say?" Mark asked, his voice neutral. Jill leaned forward, her expression contrite. "Mark, I'm sorry for the way I acted. I was angry with you, and instead of talking things out with you, I tried to make you jealous by flirting with those guys. They were young and buff and made me feel like I was some kind of queen. The flattery went to my head and I decided I needed payback for what you'd done." Mark blinked at her, genuine confusion on his face. "What the heck are you talking about? What the heck did I do?" "Oh, come on, Mark." Jill's voice rose slightly. "I saw you at the Hilton. Jane and I both saw you hugging the young girl. You were right in front of the elevator, so Jane and I knew you'd been upstairs with her, you jerk. How could you do that to me and then just come home like nothing happened?" It took a few moments for Mark to put it together. "About 4 months ago, you saw me with a tall, beautiful African-American lady, maybe 23 to 24. "Yes!" Jill exclaimed. "She hugged you and kissed your cheek. She must have been very pleased with what you paid her." Mark's face darkened in anger. "Paid her? You thought she was a hooker?" "Spiked heels, beautiful short outfit, and she was all over you, and you were all smiles as you hugged her. It was disgusting." "So you caught me with a hooker, and you never said anything about it?" Mark asked, his voice dangerously calm. "I was going to storm over there and confront you, but Janie stopped me. She said all men are dogs, and I should get my revenge before I confront you." "Janie? Your 3 times divorced friend from work? That Janie? The girl who, after knowing me for 30 minutes, said I was not good enough for you? That Janie?" "Unlike you, she thinks I'm something special," Jill snapped. Then she took a deep breath. "Look, Mark, I don't want to fight. We both made a mistake. Can't we put this behind us and stop this silly divorce? I forgive you for what you did. Can't you forgive me?" "You forgive me?" Mark asked, incredulity in his voice. "Yes, of course. I was angry and acted out. That was wrong. I shouldn't have done what I did. I should have talked it out with you. I love you, Mark. I want you back." "So, we're even? You slept with those 2 guys and now we're even?" Mark asked casually. She chuckled. "Actually, you showed up too soon for me to do much with Danny, and I didn't sleep with Steven. But none of that matters now." "It matters to me," Mark said softly. Jill tilted her head and looked puzzled. "Why?" "You cheated. I cheated. Now we're even, just like you said." "No, I just asked if that was what you believed. You admitted to pleasuring one guy and planning to sleep with another, but I interrupted your plans." "Yeah, so? You slept with that tramp, so we're even," she shouted. "No, I didn't, and no, she isn't, and no, we're not." "What the heck does that mean?" she asked. "You remember my PA, Marianne? Don't tell me you slept with her too. Number that Friday. You saw me at the Hilton. I had just dropped Marianne off. She got on the elevator, and a second later, the other elevator opened, and Bree stepped out. She had come down from her room to greet Marianne." Mark's voice grew calmer as he continued. "Bree was shocked to see me, but I explained that Marianne's car had died, so I took her to the Hilton. Bree hugged me and kissed me because she was so thankful I had gotten Marianne there for her big surprise. You see, Bree was having lunch delivered to her room, and during lunch, she planned to propose to Marianne." "Propose?" Jill's face showed genuine confusion. "Yes. She and Marianne have been dating for the last 3 years. But I thought, yeah, you listened to that troublemaker Janie when you both jumped to the wrong conclusion. So you never cheated?" "No, but you did, and—" Mark lifted his phone. "Now I have your recorded confession, so sign the darn papers." Mark stood up, but instead of walking out, he reached for a folder on the side table. "But before you do, I have something I want to show you." Jill looked at him warily as he pulled out a tablet and placed it in front of her. "What's this?" "Press play," Mark instructed. Jill hesitantly pressed the play button. The screen showed a compilation of text messages between her and Danny after the resort incident, along with time-stamped photos of her meeting her co-worker at various hotels over the past few months. The final image was of Jane, her trusted friend, meeting with the same co-worker at a different hotel. "What the heck is this?" Jill demanded, her face flushing. "That's just the appetizer," Mark said calmly. He pulled out a second folder and placed it on the table. "In here are sworn statements from Danny about your behavior at the resort and afterward. There's also a statement from your colleague's wife, who is now filing for divorce herself. She's quite grateful for the evidence we shared with her." Jill's face had gone pale. "You can't do this to me." "I already have," Mark said. "But don't worry, I'm not done yet." He pulled out his phone and sent a text. Moments later, the conference room door opened, and in walked Jill's parents, followed by her boss from work. "Mom? Dad? Mr. Reynolds? What's going on?" Jill stammered, rising to her feet. Mark gestured for everyone to take a seat. "I thought it was important that everyone hear the truth directly. You see, Jill has been spreading some rather hurtful lies about me, both personally and professionally." "Mark, please," Jill pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You accused me of cheating, then used that as justification for your own infidelity. You told Danny I was verbally abusive. You told your co-workers I was controlling and jealous. And worst of all, you've been having an affair with a married man at your company, violating not just your marriage vows but also company policy on workplace relationships." Mr. Reynolds, Jill's boss, looked particularly uncomfortable. "Is this true, Jill?" Before she could respond, Mark played the recording he'd made just minutes earlier, where Jill admitted to her actions at the resort. Her parents looked devastated. Her father couldn't even meet her eyes. Her mother dabbed at tears with a tissue. "I didn't come here to humiliate you, Jill," Mark said, his voice losing some of its edge. "I came here to set the record straight. I wanted everyone to know that I never cheated on you. I never abused you. I loved you faithfully for 7 years." He turned to her parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry it's come to this. I truly loved your daughter, and I thought we had a good marriage. I wish things had turned out differently." To Mr. Reynolds, he said, "I apologize for bringing this into your workplace, but I felt it was important you knew the truth, especially given the company's strict policies on workplace relationships." Mark gathered his materials and stood. "The papers are ready to be signed. Richard will handle the rest. Goodbye, Jill." As he turned to leave, Jill called out, "Mark, wait!" "Please." He paused at the door but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I was wrong about everything. Please don't do this." Mark finally turned to face her. You did this, Jill. Not me. Actions have consequences. With that, he walked out, closing the door behind him. 6 months later, Mark sat on the patio of his new beachfront condo, watching the sunset with a glass of bourbon in hand. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, and contrary to what many of his friends had warned, he felt no remorse about how he'd handled things. Jill had been forced to resign from her position after the company launched an investigation into her relationship with her married colleague. She'd moved back in with her parents temporarily before finding a job in another state. Her brothers occasionally reached out to check on Mark, having firmly taken his side in the divorce. The sound of the sliding door opening behind him made Mark smile. Grace, Bree's older sister, stepped onto the patio carrying 2 plates of food. "Dinner is served," she announced, setting the plates on the table. "Though I still think I should be concerned that you're more interested in watching the sunset than helping me in the kitchen." Mark laughed and pulled her onto his lap. "The view is pretty spectacular." "The view of the Gulf, or the view of me cooking?" she teased, draping her arms around his neck. "Both," he admitted, "but mostly you." Grace had been a surprise blessing in his life. Bree and Mary Ann had indeed invited him to dinner after the confrontation with Jill, and Grace had been there as promised. They'd hit it off immediately, and 6 months later they were practically living together. "Have you heard anything?" Grace asked gently, knowing Mark had been expecting a call. Mark nodded, his smile widening. "Got the offer letter today. Seattle office wants me to start next month. Full relocation package, significant salary bump, and a promise of partnership within 3 years if all goes well." Grace squealed and hugged him tightly. "That's fantastic. I told you they'd be crazy not to want you. And you're still sure about moving?" "Leaving your dance studio behind?" Mark asked, searching her eyes for any hesitation. "Are you kidding? Seattle has an amazing dance scene. I've already been in touch with 3 studios that are interested in having me teach. Plus," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "I hear it rains a lot there, which means more indoor activities." Mark laughed and pulled her close for a kiss. "Have I told you today how much I adore you?" "You have, but I never get tired of hearing it." She stood and tugged at his hand. "Now come eat before dinner gets cold. We've got a lot to celebrate." As they settled at the table, Mark couldn't help but marvel at how completely his life had changed in just 6 months. The pain of Jill's betrayal had faded, replaced by a deeper appreciation for honest, mature love. Grace was everything Jill wasn't: straightforward, supportive, and genuinely interested in building a life together rather than seeking validation elsewhere. "Penny for your thoughts?" Grace asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "Just thinking about how sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us to the best ones," Mark replied. "If Jill hadn't cheated, I wouldn't have met you." Grace smiled softly. "Well, when you put it that way, I almost want to send her a thank you note." They laughed together, and Mark raised his glass. "To new beginnings." "To new beginnings," Grace echoed, clinking her glass against his. Later that night, as they lay in bed with Grace's head resting on his chest, Mark received a text from Brad, Jill's brother. "Just heard you're moving to Seattle," the text read. "Congrats on the new job. You deserve all the happiness in the world, man. Keep in touch." Mark smiled and typed a quick reply. "Thanks, Brad. Grace and I would love to have you visit once we're settled. Life has a way of working out exactly as it should." He set his phone aside and wrapped his arm more securely around Grace's sleeping form. The ultimate revenge, he realized, wasn't in humiliating Jill or exposing her lies. It was in finding genuine happiness and moving forward without carrying the weight of bitterness or regret. Mark had once thought his world had ended when he walked into that hotel suite and saw his wife with another man. Now he understood it had only been the end of one chapter and the beginning of something far better than he could have imagined. And that, he decided as sleep began to claim him, was the sweetest revenge of all. And so, we've reached the end of today's story. Was it what you expected, or did it take a twist you didn't see coming? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below, and let's get a conversation going. If this story kept you hooked, make sure to hit that like button. And if you're new here or just haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to join our community. I bring you fresh, captivating stories every day, so click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.